Hello, everyone. Our next speaker will be Barb Rosenstock. Miss Rosenstock writes narrative nonfiction, historical fiction picture books for children. She's worked as an author to make history more relatable for children as well. Her exquisite and stunning work has won her many awards, like the California Library Association's Beatty Award. And today, she's going to talk to us about Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir. In Miss Rosenstock's bio on her website, she states that she's good at sleeping anywhere, knowing useless stuff, organizing, reading, cooking, and talking. On the other hand, she says she isn't that good at eating healthy, slowing down, or playing sports. These statements led me to believe that we must be related. I also can sleep anywhere and cannot play a sport to save my life. The final thing that Barb Rosenstock listed in her bio were the best things that have ever happened to her. Among these, she listed her family, her books, and meeting us. We should feel pretty lucky. Please join me in welcoming Miss Barb Rosenstock.
Thanks. Thank you. Good morning, still. Is it still morning? It's still morning. I'd like to start by thanking Clay Jenkinson for first contacting me about this symposium, and Sharon Kelzer, Pam, and the Pams, Pam Kukla and Pam Pierce, for their limitless work on the details. I'm sure Theodore Roosevelt would applaud the passion and energy they bring to the work of expanding on his legacy. However, oh, yay! Yay! However, when Clay, now I'm going to get to my real part. When Clay suggested I give this talk, I wasn't entirely sure what in the world he was thinking. I had to Google Clay Jenkinson and make sure he wasn't nuts. I am not an academic, and I do not hold degrees in history or politics, or mammalian whatever Darren is that is so smart that I don't even know what it is. I am not, in fact, any kind of Theodore Roosevelt expert. So I'm going to ask for everybody's forgiveness in advance for any errors. And also, as you can see here, I typically talk to audiences between 6 and 10 years old. And most of you seem a little bit taller and a little bit less fidgety than that crowd. But honestly, that is the cutest Theodore Roosevelt impersonator you guys are ever going to see today. Sorry, Clay, even cuter than you. I'm hoping you'll want to hear from an average person who was captivated by a small part of the Theodore Roosevelt story and how researching that story of his camping trip with John Muir changed my world. It's horribly embarrassing to admit this in present company. But other than a few facts from those souvenir presidential placemats, like at the toll booths, and way too many viewings of the movie Night at the Museum with my kids, 10 years ago, I'd have been hard-pressed to tell you anything about Theodore Roosevelt other than he hunted big game, he had a mustache, and he hunted big game. The other thing you must know is that I was not a writer. I was a corporate marketing executive who took a break from a 19-year career to get a master's degree in teaching and raise 2 sons with my husband in suburban Chicago. The thing is, as they grew, my boys, oh my God, I wish they were that little still, didn't seem to like children's books that rhymed or featured talking bunnies. They tended to like stories about real people. And back then, it was a challenge to find history-related children's stories that didn't read like 4th grade textbooks, full of facts, but completely missing any emotion. So whenever my boys seemed bored as I read, I started making up the stories to go with the pictures. Fast forward a few years, and I was actively writing, submitting, and getting rejections on children's books that featured, no, of course not history, but rhymes and talking bunnies. I had not learned the lesson of writing what you care about, but instead tried to write what I saw pushed in the bookstores. Excuse me. I was, as John Muir once wrote in his journal, on the world, but not in it. Not one manuscript sold. And here are rejection letters from 25 different publishers to prove it. 5 of whom I work for now today. Oh, I'm going to have to just toss this over there. I forgot that that's hard to fold back up. I don't want to waste time doing it. That changed with one line in a Chicago Tribune article of a review on a book on Theodore Roosevelt. I don't remember which book it was. The reviewer mentioned, oh, that time Roosevelt left the presidency to camp in Yosemite. And I stopped and I reread those words thinking, how could a president just leave and go camping? I immediately got up, internet searched Roosevelt camping, and found this famous photograph, which really just resulted in more questions. Who's that old scrawny guy standing next to the president? How could any sitting president be allowed to be that much alone? And on and on. I wondered, but I really wasn't convinced about whether the idea of a president camping might make a decent children's book. I read biographies on both Muir and Roosevelt, but my local librarian could find hardly anything about a camping trip. So I took notes on any minuscule mentions and learned thousands of facts about both men. Here are the 3 things I knew about their camping trip. Number 1, Roosevelt wrote a letter on March 14, 1903, asking Muir to guide him through Yosemite. Letter looks like that. The letter reads in part, I do not want anyone with me but you, and I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days and just be out in the open with you. Those words struck me as poetic. So perhaps there was more to Theodore Roosevelt than the stereotypes I'd learned. Number 2, in May 1903, Roosevelt traveled to Raymond, California, where he first met Muir, who had a home and farm about 100 miles away in Martinez, California. There were a lot of events planned, but Roosevelt and Muir somehow went off into the wild for camp for 3 days. Were they always alone? I didn't know. And number 3, by 1906, and you saw this cartoon earlier, goofy-looking Theodore Roosevelt had signed a bill that put the Yosemite Valley and Mariposa Grove under federal protection as part of the Yosemite National Park, and eventually added almost 150 million acres to the national forests. All right, don't laugh, but at the time I thought 3 facts and a general sense of both men was enough research for an entire book. So, because I'm a beginner, remember? So I worked it up into a confusing picture book manuscript that tried to cover the whole of both men's lives and called it Teety and Johnny, the Wild Boys That Saved America's Wild Places. I submitted this masterpiece only to get multiple rejections, this time with a few comments like, hey, great idea on that camping trip part, but the rest is a damn mess. I tried to keep in mind Roosevelt's quote that Clay or Darren, I can't remember which one, mentioned last night, there is no effort without error. But frankly, I was lost. So I started over. Tracing the events back to the essential question that any author should know, what is my story really about? Yes, a camping trip, but what was its core? I began learning the value of historical places, people, and objects that make up the kind of primary research I'd never done before. I started searching for the story's heart. And that heart turned out to be the friendship between John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt. Now, one would have a hard time inventing, let alone finding in real life, 2 men more opposite. In looks, Roosevelt was stocky and prosperously fashionable. Muir was very thin and often disheveled at best. At the time of the camping trip, remember, Muir was 65 years old to Roosevelt's 44, so they were roughly a generation apart. They almost literally were born in different worlds. Roosevelt, a typically pampered son of a prominent New York City business family with loving family relationships. Muir, the impoverished immigrant son of a harsh religious Scotsman who farmed in rural Wisconsin and to be nice, believed much too strongly in spare the rod, spoil the child. Even given historical differences in child raising, Muir was frankly abused by his father. Roosevelt graduated Phi Beta Kappa, of course, it's Teddy, from the exclusive Harvard. Muir dropped out of a public institution, the University of Wisconsin in Madison. One-word personality descriptions, these are my personality descriptions. Roosevelt gregarious, Muir thoughtful. John Muir, early on averse to violence of any kind, and given his dad, I don't think we can blame him. Dodged serving in the Civil War by moving up into Canada. Muir fasted often, ate meat irregularly, and called hunting animals the murder business. Theodore Roosevelt had that famous military legacy as a Rough Rider, then Secretary of the Navy, and we all know about his hunting thing, as well as his hearty appetite and the supposed saying, good to the last drop. Right? Roosevelt was first married at 22, had 6 children, 5 of them in a very short time frame, and his adult life was centered on the East Coast. Muir first married only at 42 years of age, had 2 daughters, each more than 5 years apart in age, and his adult life was centered on the West Coast. The differences go on and on and on. Another question, maybe the most important question, came up after I looked at these 2 opposite lives side by side. I told you I was a beginner. This is the beginning of my first book. Like this. Roosevelt's on one side, Muir's on the other side of the timeline. Would you camp for 3 days with a stranger with whom you had nothing in common? You guys look like you would. In Chicago, we would not do that. God forbid, right? So either they weren't strangers, or it was crucially important, or maybe a little of both. It is true that Muir and Roosevelt had never met in person before the start of the camping trip on May 15th, 1903. TR might have felt he knew Muir a bit because of the first thing they did have in common: the great pleasure they both took in books and storytelling. Both were avid readers and writers. Muir penned something like 12 books and hundreds of articles and essays, while eventually Roosevelt authored over 30 more, books, I believe. Brinkley's Wilderness Warrior, among others, states that Roosevelt had read every single one of the books Muir wrote. With TR's lifelong fascination with natural history, maybe that's not surprising, but with his busy life, he also obviously thought Muir in particular had something special to say. So though they were personally strangers, Roosevelt, along with many other readers, probably felt he knew Muir's life from his writings. For John Muir, someone who I think often has been a little bit forgotten now, was quite famous. John of the Mountains, a globally known traveling preservationist, not conservationist, a leading nature scientist, and an acknowledged wise man. He was also a brilliant prose writer, engaging city people especially with new ideas about experiencing wilderness, as in this beginning paragraph on the birds of Yosemite from his 1901 book, Our National Parks. He writes, "Travelers in the Sierra forests usually complain of the want of life. The trees, they say, are fine, but the empty stillness is deadly. There are no animals to be seen, no birds. We have not heard a song in all these woods." And no wonder. They go in large parties with mules and horses. They make a great noise. They are dressed in outlandish, unnatural colors. Every animal shuns them. Even the frightened pines would run away if they could. But nature lovers, devout, silent, open-eyed, looking and listening with love, find no lack of inhabitants in these mountain mansions, and they come to us gladly. As an astute politician, Roosevelt and his staff certainly couldn't resist keeping track of Muir's efforts to save California's, and in fact the planet's wilderness, his success in getting parts of Yosemite protected as a national park in 1890, his 1892 founding of the Sierra Club. Sorry about the bad slide. It was really hard to find the original seal of the Sierra Club, but that is it. And its ongoing political efforts, including protecting Mount Rainier as a national park in 1899. Also, I'm not sure TR could have resisted Muir's scientific study of nature, Muir's theories on glaciation. Is that going to go? Oops. Oh no, my movies don't work. Oh well. John Muir was the person who one of the first people to realize that Yosemite Valley was carved by glaciers. And Muir also wrote a lot of first-person nature encounter stories starring squirrels, snakes, and bears. So when in 1901, Muir wrote a book calling on the US government to save the trees. That's a direct quote, save the trees. TR answered. It suited Roosevelt's vision for a country then controlled by unbridled capitalism and Roosevelt's vision for a great legacy. For Theodore Roosevelt loved the natural world. That's not news to you all, but for me, coming from that big hunter, mindlessly blasting away kind of stereotype, and having been raised in an urban area where gun violence is all too common and senseless. The idea that guns, hunters, and saving wilderness ever went together was a new one. The Boone and Crockett Club that TR and Grinnell founded in 1887 to save big game, you know, the one, it still exists today. I'd never heard of it. All right, TR was as romantic an advocate for wilderness as Muir, but with a much more human use-oriented bent. He wanted it both ways. We are still not sure today if this is possible. And though his views altered over time, Muir would argue almost throughout his whole entire life that it was not possible. We are to be part of nature, but we are not to manage it. Despite these differences, and to his everlasting credit, even before 1903, Roosevelt had already put political muscle behind preserving national forests, as well as our earliest game and bird preserves. He saw the mountains, the bear, the deer, the elk, especially those in the Wild West, as America's most important heritage, essential things that could not disappear without diminishing the nation itself. And it was all disappearing fast, as Char said earlier, much faster than expected. It was a crucial issue. This is the logging of a sequoia. What would the country have looked like without folks like Muir and Roosevelt, among so many others, saving what they could when they could? The norm was Fred Weyerhaeuser, who bought, cut, and abandoned millions of acres of old-growth forest across the country without a thought to replanting. Sheep were grazing totally bare, lands supposedly protected by state and federal law. Businesses regularly invaded the few national parks and forests there were. There was no regular security force, so who was going to stop them? The buffalo were gone. Conservatively, 60 million buffalo reduced to less than 1,000. Grizzlies were on their last leg, many species of wolves, fox, birds, either at or over the brink of extinction. That's 1901, right there in the red. It's an extinction graph for mammals and birds, I believe. Even with the president's bent toward human use versus exclusive preservation, he faced powerful opponents. Those who thought the wilderness would recover, or they didn't, or those who didn't care because of the immense amounts of money involved. Railroads, mining companies, big timber. To simplify the issues a great deal, and Char did a much more better job of explaining the issues, Theodore Roosevelt at some point needed the public on his side in conservation, and with his big bully pulpit, he went out to get them. Roosevelt left Washington on on the longest, most publicized cross-country trip by any president up to that point, April 1st. April 1st is my birthday, 1903. You could probably tell that already. The camping trip I wound up writing about turned out to be part of a much wider effort called the Great Loop Tour, a campaign for re-election which included preaching about America's natural heritage to her citizens. It was a killing schedule for Theodore Roosevelt and his staff. A 14,000-mile, 66-day journey through 22 states and territories in the Midwest and West. Before he toured Yosemite with Muir, he whistle-stopped, waved, and, Teddy speechified through hundreds of small towns and big cities, and also camped in Yellowstone with John Burroughs, whom Roosevelt knew well. Now, I'd never been west of Nebraska, except to the city of Los Angeles. I realized there was no way to get this story right without seeing Yosemite in person. So I traveled there in September of 2007 at its least impressive low water time. I did not camp. Oh gosh, God forbid again. But stayed in a Park Service cabin with my mom. There she is in the phone book. Hi, Mom. Phone box, which we still had, I guess, in 2007 in Yosemite. And my sister. And I'm no photographer. These pictures were taken on a very early iPhone. But still and always, Yosemite, the place, speaks for itself. And it turns out John Muir was right. The farther you go from the crowds, and in today's era, the paved roads and the electric buses and the screaming people at each other, the more Yosemite speaks. I could only imagine what it was like in 1903, but could I do more than imagine? Well, I learned that some of our national parks, and Yosemite is one of them, have actual libraries in them. Do we live in a great country or what? I mean, we have national parks and libraries in them. It's like a nerd's dream. There is a Yosemite Research Library upstairs in the museum, and Linda Eade was its librarian. Linda had half a shelf on the camping trip, including period photos, illustrations, news articles, and a typed up, at that time unpublished version of the only first-person account of the trip by Charlie Leidig, who was there as a guide. And just as an aside, as far as we can tell, Charlie Leidig was also the first person on the planet to whom the term park ranger ever applied. Others along on the trip with Muir and Roosevelt were another guide named Archie Leonard and an army packer named Jacker Alder. However, there was also a huge official entourage with the president, as there always is, including 4 Secret Service men, Roosevelt's Secretary William Loeb Jr., Columbia University's president Nicholas Murray Butler, the Surgeon General for some reason, Dr. Rixey, California's Governor George Pardee, William Moody, who was Secretary of the Navy, and Benjamin Wheeler, President of the University of California at Berkeley. Now, various people took credit and wrote letters that helped Muir and Roosevelt get together, but it was Wheeler who made the final arrangements. You see, Muir was leaving on a world tour in May, which is part of the reason he at first refused Roosevelt's request. Can you imagine? Theodore Roosevelt asks you to do something and you go, yeah, nah. Muir didn't want to take the president camping. He was tired of politicians and empty promises. And he also had a ton of preparations to do before that around the world trip. Wheeler basically ordered Muir to change his tour dates and take Roosevelt camping with this stern note: John, you surely ought not to let this opportunity fail. It was so important. And others who cared about conservation knew Muir's potential power once he had the president in Yosemite's gorgeous grip. So, here is the more than 3 facts version, the real story of the camping trip and its effect on the Muir-Roosevelt relationship as far as can be determined. The morning of May 15, 1903, Roosevelt arrived in Raymond on the presidential special. Theodore's presidential special looked like that. Muir was on the train already, but they hadn't met. Okay, and I just have to tell you the story of why they hadn't met, because it's such a typical John Muir story. The day before, May 14th, Roosevelt had a speaking engagement at and a bunch of dinners at the University of California. Muir was, of course, invited to sit on the dais, but he said he was too busy with his cherry crop. So in his place, he sends his 17-year-old daughter, Helen, who was almost not seated at all because she was the only woman there. Muir was not the kind of person to be terribly concerned with proprieties. So anyway, Helen is eventually seated, all the dinners go on, Roosevelt's having dinner, he's having drinks up in Berkeley, and Muir finishes with the cherries at home, whatever he was doing. This is a view of his home. This is Muir's home in Martinez and some of his land. He also owned it with his father-in-law. From roughly the same time as the camping trip. I think that picture was from 1901. So Muir has supper, finishes with the cherries, has supper, takes the ferry over to Oakland, goes to Berkeley. It's almost 10 o'clock at night when he finds that presidential special waiting on a siding. He simply climbs on the train and finds a Pullman porter. Hey, I'm John Muir. Anybody here? Muir asks to be shown to bed, but instead the porter, of course, tells him it's not proper to retire before the president returns to the train. Muir's response, but it's my bedtime. And he goes right to sleep without ever meeting Theodore Roosevelt. Can you imagine? TR gets back to the train about 1 a.m., and Muir is out like a light. That is a self-portrait by John Muir of John Muir sleeping under a tree. He always believed in a good night's rest. Through the night, the presidential train, after they both were on board but hadn't met, makes its way toward Yosemite itself. Now, because of this grueling Great Loop tour schedule, Roosevelt had hoped to rest a bit in the wilderness. Instead, at 7:30 a.m. on day one of the trip, the train pulls into Raymond, which is the last real town before the Yosemite wilderness at the time, population less than 500 people. And there, Roosevelt's surprised to find essentially the whole town waiting for him. He isn't prepared at all, but he's Theodore Roosevelt. So he speaks quickly off the cuff, probably brilliantly, about seeing Yosemite with Muir, who he must have met at some point that morning, but no one knows where or how, or when, really. At this point, as far as we can tell, just like in their letters, they are Mr. President and Mr. Muir to each other. In addition to missing pieces of the historical record, even the best accounts of the trip start to differ a bit right here. The president's whole party, which includes Muir at this point, either gets into one or two 11-passenger coaches that looked kind of like that. The Theodore is in the back there, isn't he? Yeah, there he is, there in the back. The president was either driven by a man named Tom Gordon or a man named Bright Gillespie, which is honestly a name so fabulous, somebody in this room's got to put it in a book someday. They were escorted by a Lieutenant Mays and 30 cavalrymen, but they went either first to Sells-Awani Tavern, which is what I think probably happened. That's what always happened. You stopped at the tavern before you went to the trees. And then to the Mariposa Grove, or else, according to Charlie Leidig, who was there, directly to the Mariposa Grove. The photographers Underwood and Underwood took formal pictures. Then Roosevelt dismissed the troops, and the stagecoach took all the members of his party to the Wawana Hotel, except John Muir, Theodore Roosevelt, Charlie Leidig, Archie Leonard, Jack Alder, 4 horses for the men, and 4 mules that hauled equipment. So for most of the time, the camping trip really looked like that. In an unprecedented move, the Secret Service did not accompany Roosevelt, and the press wasn't allowed on the trip either, on most of the trip either. Roosevelt made a huge effort to be alone in the wilderness with Muir. For example, according to the official schedule, TR was supposed to have dinner at the hotel that night. There were fireworks planned, speeches, politics. Instead, the officials stayed at the hotel while he and Muir stayed far away from them under the giant sequoias. Leidig cooked beefsteak, fried chicken, and strong coffee over the fire. They camped right under the grizzly giant. TR slept under a shelter half, which is kind of like a pup tent with kind of like a tree or something for the third side, with 40 blankets piled up for warmth. He was still the president of the United States after all. Muir rolled up in his own blanket, which he always carried with him, on a bed of branches, as he often did. But what did the two speak about the entire day? Just like their historic introduction, no one thought it was important enough to note. And now is as good a time as any to make clear, as it does say in my author's note, that my children's book, The Camping Trip That Changed America, is historical fiction. I did stick as close to the known facts as possible and had many historical experts read that manuscript. But when it was necessary for story flow, I imagined scenes like Muir and Roosevelt's meeting. And if anyone has questions about my fictional choices, I'm totally happy to discuss them when it's time for questions at the end. So let's go back to the trip. On day 2, May 16th, 1903, they broke camp at Mariposa Grove and were on horses by 6:30 in the morning. Roosevelt asked the guides, Charlie and Archie, to, quote, keep away from civilization. And so they didn't go anywhere near the hotel where everyone else was at. Instead, they went down Lightning Trail, crossed the South Fork of the Merced River to Empire Meadows Trail, where they ate a cold lunch. They climbed towards Sentinel Dome. The San Francisco Chronicle described their day like this. The president rode through deep snow, accompanied by John Muir and guides Leonard and Leidig, stopping now and then to allow the fatigued horses to rest before plunging through another snowdrift. Now, I'm not sure how the reporter actually knew that. Maybe there was fake news all the way back then. There was fake news and real news always, right? But perhaps some press did follow at a distance. We really don't know. In Bridal Veil Meadows, the snow was almost 5 feet deep. Roosevelt's horse got stuck, so Charlie Leidig had to use a log, push it up under the horse to get them out. Muir wanted to camp right behind Sentinel Dome, but Charlie won out, so they camped at Glacier Point because they had water there. Okay, Theodore, that was kind of an important thing. Charlie heard Muir and Roosevelt talking around the campfire far into the night about many topics. We know that they talked, not specific words, but we know they talked about Muir's glacial theory of the Yosemite's formation, conservation of the country's forests in general, and Yosemite's big trees in particular. They discussed setting and which lands to set aside in the U.S. for other national parks. They also seemed to have problems conversing at times, not because they ran out of things to say, as you think you might with a stranger, but because, to quote Leidig, they both men wanted to do the talking. They were trading stories and stepping on each other's words. They were becoming friends. That night, they both rolled up in tarps and blankets and woke up on day 3, May 17th, covered in 5 inches of snow. As TR related later that day, we slept in a snowstorm last night. This has been the grandest day of my life. Although he had lots of those, right? We're learning that. They traveled down to Glacier Point for pictures that had been prearranged. This one, which is also part of that one that's on the stage, the lovely picture on the stage here, was taken by Underwood and Underwood also. There were at least 5 professional photographers on hand for this set, including press, some of the official party who had come by stage to meet the president along the way. After pictures, though, Roosevelt, Muir, Charlie, Archie, and Jack left everyone else at Glacier Point, which again was not necessarily in the plans. There's some talk of these people like scrambling around going, where's he going? He's Theodore Roosevelt, he's going where he wants. And continued on their rambles. Muir picked twigs and was threading them in Roosevelt's buttonhole, which the president found incredibly irritating. What are you doing? And to me, that also said that now they really might have been becoming friends, because you don't really have a friend until sometimes they bug the heck out of you sometimes, right? They spent a lot of time quizzing each other on birds they heard. You're going to hear more about Theodore Roosevelt and his birds later today. Which bird is that, Teddy? Which bird is that? Actually, which bird is that, Mr. President? What about that one, Mr. Muir? Roosevelt won the contest. He seemed to know the songs of every bird they encountered, and he would whistle in reply and often got an answer. Muir was stunned. They went to Little Yosemite Valley for an outdoor lunch, which looked in early spring, something in between these next two pictures. I couldn't find an early spring one, not in my own pictures and not from anybody else's either. That's spring, almost summer there. And this is really winter, so pretend we're in the middle of the seasons. A huge crowd, though, of the people from Raymond had gathered there. Roosevelt requested they be kept at a distance so he could continue to rough it. They reached Camp Curry at 2 p.m., where a crowd of women blocked the way because they wanted to shake hands with the president. Roosevelt was very annoyed and asked Charlie to, quote, do something. So Charlie reared up on his already half-wild horse. The women back off, and the president gaily waves his hat, shouts his apologies to the ladies, and follows Charlie right on past. Sorry, ladies, can't stop. When they reached Sentinel Bridge, officials were there to meet him. The president was tired, but the whole party went to the artist Chris Jorgensen's studio. Even Theodore couldn't get away from doing some schmoozing. They went for 15 minutes, had a glass of champagne. Jorgensen lived and painted in Yosemite. This is a painting of his. He and his wife offered a room for the president to spend the night indoors because the people in Yosemite were sort of really uncomfortable with the fact that the president had come all the way to Yosemite and he was sleeping on the ground. You know, they didn't want to be like they wouldn't want to be known as the wild people of the mountains, right? They say, please, we have a warm bed. It's a feather bed. Won't you stay? And Roosevelt politely refused. Always the politician, though, he hugged and blessed a little girl and then gave a hearty scolding to a boy who made the mistake of yelling out, "Hi, Teddy!" to the President of the United States. The small party of 5 then left the officials and continued down the valley to pick a campsite near Bridal Veil Falls, which is where Muir wanted to spend their last night. This is a quick iPhone video I took at their last campsite, but because the last video didn't work, I'm not sure this one is going to. So let's see if it does. It does not. Darn it. Anyway, pretend this is moving. Okay. Beautiful does not do this place justice. It is in the middle of, even today, it is in the middle of essentially almost nowhere. As they traveled down the south side of the river, a crowd of people followed them and started filling in Bridal Veil meadows. Trying to camp again, TR said, Leidig, Charlie, these people annoy me. Can you get rid of them? So Charlie has no horse at this point, right? He tells the crowd, the president, he walks away and just says to the crowd, the president's very tired. And he asks them all to leave. And every single person left, some of them walking away on tiptoe so as not to disturb Theodore Roosevelt. That would not happen today. Charlie, Roosevelt then said, I'm hungry as hell. Cook any damn thing you wish. How long is it going to take? Leidig said he needed 30 minutes. So TR fell fast asleep on a blanket and snored loudly. He woke up for dinner with Muir, and the two went away from everyone out in the meadow again until way after dark. Talking. No one recorded the specifics. When they returned, they sat around the campfire, and the president told stories, including some about past hunting trips. And some accounts say that this might have been when Muir asked TR, where's your phone? No, he didn't ask me. I'm teasing you. When Muir asked TR, when are you going to get beyond the boyishness of killing things? Are you not getting far enough along to leave that off? TR supposedly looked around for a moment and thoughtfully replied, Muir, I guess you are right. Theodore Roosevelt said you were right. I'm not sure that story happened. But the friends slept their last night together under the trees. Before dawn on May 4th, May 4th, on day 4, May 18th, crowds of people started coming back to Bridal Veil Meadows and could be spotted through the brush. People were like Kim Kardashian. He was like the Kim Kardashian of Yosemite. Charlie kept them away until after breakfast. Then the stage came down with the official party, and TR said goodbye to his guides. Tom Gordon, for sure, was the stage driver this time, covering the 69-mile trip back to Raymond with TR, Muir, and the officials in about 10 hours. That, in total, is basically the trip. No one knows exactly when Muir left the president, but it could have been Lathrop, which would have been the nearest station for him to transfer and get a train back home to Martinez. Years later, in an appreciation of Muir and Outlook, Roosevelt told a version of the following story that happened as they said their camping trip goodbyes. A scientific colleague had written Muir a letter requesting personal letters of introduction from President Roosevelt to Russia's Tsar and China's emperor. Like, in other words, John, as long as you're going to camp with Theodore, ask him if you can get a letter to these guys. Because that way the scientists, as part of this world tour that Muir was going on, could study trees in the Siberia and Manchuria uninhibited by local officials. Anytime they were stopped, they could say, the Tsar says, right? Or the emperor says. But Roosevelt explains to Muir that he can't just introduce like random people to heads of state. So Muir, thinking perhaps Roosevelt doesn't understand what his colleague needs, simply hands TR the original letter and says, I don't know, read it yourself. Roosevelt begins reading this letter that Muir gave him. And then he stops, and he laughs, and he laughs, and he says, John, and notice it's John at the end of this trip, not Mr. Muir. John, do you remember exactly the words in which this letter was couched? Muir looks startled and says, good gracious, there was something unpleasant about you in it, wasn't there? I'd forgotten. At the beginning of the letter that Muir had handed Roosevelt were these words. Yep. A sloppy interest. And it goes on from there, a few other choice comments. Now, Roosevelt, to his credit, I say it all the time, Roosevelt, to his credit, so admired Muir's innocence and his honesty, or by this point maybe felt close enough to him, that he sent along those diplomatic introduction letters the very next day in spite of the insults. Though I discovered that they were both at the same public function about 7 years later in Los Angeles. Theodore and John, or T.D. and Johnny, as I called them in the book, never spent any length of time together again. 2 days later, May 19th from Sacramento, when he enclosed the diplomatic letters, Roosevelt writes directly to Muir in part, how happy were the 3 days in Yosemite I owed to you, and how greatly I appreciated them. I shall never forget our 3 camps. The first in the solemn temple of the giant sequoias, the next in the snowstorm among the silver firs near the brink of the cliff, and the third on the floor of the Yosemite in an open valley fronting the stupendous rocky mass of El Capitan, with the falls thundering in the distance on either hand. In total, there are only 9 letters from Muir to Roosevelt and 10 from Roosevelt to Muir. They talk of policy, mostly, and often did not agree, sometimes vehemently so, for example, on the flooding of the Hetch Hetchy Valley and the failure to prevent it that some people say hastened Muir's death in 1914. But most of the letters still include tender phrases from Theodore to John. I wish I could see you in person. And from John to Theodore after his final term ended, somehow this whole country seems lonesome to me since you left Washington. And this one letter, which could still choke me up, from Roosevelt, a man who had early on lost a young and much-loved wife, sent in condolence to Muir upon his wife's death. Roosevelt knows Muir well. The letter ends, get out among the mountains and trees, friends. tree's friend as soon as you can. They will do more for you than either man or woman could. Muir had told his wife, Louie, that he had fairly fell in love with Roosevelt. Roosevelt, many years later, called this time with Muir the one day of my life that I will always remember with pleasure. The camping trip forever bonded these two mostly opposites, and Muir certainly did his job on a president who was already primed to care for nature. John Muir later proudly wrote that he'd stuffed him pretty well regarding the timber thieves and the destructive work of the lumbermen and other spoilers of the forest. And stuffed him he must have, because this is a brief summary of Roosevelt's conservation record. Starting right after the trip, Roosevelt even sounds a little bit more like Muir than usual, as in these phrases from a speech in Sacramento a few days later. As regards some of the trees, I want them preserved because they are the only things of their kind in the world. I hope for the preservation of the groves of giant trees, simply because it would be a shame to our civilization to let them disappear. We are not building this country of ours for a day. It is to last throughout the ages. So, what exactly did these two men have in common? A passion for the importance of story, a deep respect for nature, a love of country, and later a great affection for each other as fellow travelers on the planet Earth. That was enough to build a friendship and help change a country. But these were also two fathers, men who typically intend to leave the world in better shape for their children. Now, after all that primary research and the feelings that went along with the facts, I was convinced that modern children needed to know the Muir and Roosevelt story. And so I went back to the flatlands of Illinois, wrote 37 separate versions until it was almost perfect, and it wound up as my first book. Happily for me, it was illustrated by a Caldecott medalist. I got very lucky, Mordecai Gerstein, published by Penguin, and The Camping Trip That Changed America changed the course of my life. Next month, my 9th history-related picture book publishes with 8 additional books in process. One of the many reasons I took the risk and said yes to Clay's wild request is that I truly feel that Muir's passion and Roosevelt's determination turned me into a writer of history for children. Without working through that first story, learning how to track down the truth and fairly falling in love with both men, I wouldn't have discovered my own life's work of writing about the past for the future. In our world now, we desperately need children like T.D. Roosevelt and Johnny Muir. Kids who rise above their backgrounds, aren't afraid to stick their necks out, say what they believe, argue, organize, volunteer, read, write, and save the planet for future generations. That's why I write history for them, so they know they're not alone, so they know they can make a difference, so they know that Roosevelt and Muir and Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez and Susan B. Anthony and everyone, history's giants all around the world, have always struggled and failed, then struggled and succeeded before these children. T.D. Roosevelt and Johnny Muir started out as ordinary children. What's the quote? Abraham Lincoln didn't know he was Abraham Lincoln. Right? Ordinary children start out with everything they need to be real life heroes. And I think both men would want today's children to know that each of them has the potential to change our country for the better too. And our country depends on this from generation to generation. Theodore Roosevelt and his friend, John Muir, changed America. But more than 100 years after they met, and this is amazing, they also changed my life. And so today, I'm in Roosevelt's beloved North Dakota, thanking you so much for listening to all of our story. Oh, see, I told you I'm cold. I'm cold, sorry.
I'm so glad I made that call to you.
Yeah.
And you know, you're worried about accuracy and so on. I don't think anyone caught a single error except I think this is the first time that the words Theodore Roosevelt and Kim Kardashian ever appeared in the same sentence. So you have broken new ground here. We just have time for a couple of questions. Who has a question for our author? Well, should be. Who has a question for our author?
I have one.
Yes.
Here's
There's
one.
one
Go
back
ahead.
there.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Barb, good job. I'm
Thank you.
interested in Hetch Hetchy. And
Yeah.
I think there's a plan now to reclaim it and tear down that dam. I think it's called O'Shaughnessy Dam, is that right?
Yeah, it's called the O'Shaughnessy Dam. O'Shaughnessy, also Golden Gate Bridge. It all kind of goes together. Yes.
The land was taken out of National Park in 1913.
Yes, it was.
What is the plan now to reclaim that valley?
What do you know about the reclamation
What
of
the
Yosemite?
the Hetch Hetchy, not a ton, is what I know. There has been often on plans in the works. There is a Hetch Hetchy Valley foundation, kind of a foundation, I may be getting the name wrong, where a lot of school children in California there's a lot of support for this, to pull down that dam. The deal is that Yosemite Valley is here, and Hetch Hetchy is north of it. And according to John Muir, which is basically the only part of this I know, Hetch Hetchy, there was a valley more beautiful than Yosemite, and Hetch Hetchy was it. And I don't remember the year. The city of San Francisco, the land was taken out of the national park. At that time, it was part of a national park, and that entire valley was flooded for water for San Francisco. It's still what part of San Francisco uses for its water. Long time ago, and over the years, and people say, should we take down the dam? Should we not take the dam? It's just kind of a long-standing plan. I don't know how much real support it has, and I don't really know enough about the issues to talk more about it than that.
Fair enough. But it's an ongoing controversy.
It's an ongoing
and
controversy
there are
in California.
plans to possibly breach that dam.
And they want what they would like to do is the people like the Sierra Club would like to bring that valley back to what it was.
So I think everyone's going to go out and want to buy this book now because the talk was so wonderful, but the illustrations are so amazing. How do you work with an illustrator to say, here's what I'm looking to have? How much is it a collaborative effort?
You guys are not going to believe this. A lot of times, most times, authors and illustrators don't speak to each other when we're working on a picture book together. So I write a manuscript, a story, and it looks just like kind of a short-term paper that you guys may have written yourselves. And it goes to an editor. The editor and the publishing company hire an illustrator, in this case, happily and luckily and blessedly, Mordecai Gerstein. He takes my words and lets them speak to him in whatever way that is. Write sketches, draw some pencil sketches. Which I have. I'm going to speak at a school later, so my pencil sketches for the book are actually in my in another bag. But he has pencil sketches. We comment on them, but I don't get to ever speak directly to him. The first time I met him was actually in California once the book had won the Beatty Award, which is the California Library Association award for that year.
But you were happy with what he did.
I am typically amazed. I have been given just super talented illustrators. Writing a picture book, it is words and pictures, and it is not a collaborative, it is a completely collaborative art. It's almost like doing a movie or a little video, turn the page, there's a new scene, turn the page, there's a new scene. So,
Is there any
yeah.
other question here? I want to make sure I don't miss any here.
There's something there.
I liked about the back of you did on the people that take that use your Roosevelt wisely, or let's call it scientific purposes. And I noticed The two emperors who had sitting up there there was a lot of competition at work, there was a lot of competition in the field. Two of the dumbest examples of the late imperial autocracy, both eventually getting overthrown, of course, the second and the last emperor, better known as the Dowager, grandson and so forth. And you have in this book a piece of two people, one more Dowager scientific than the experimental soul, but at the same time, they realize that the money continue, and how can they use their influence well?
Right, yeah. They did.
So two bad emperors, but these two men, one a better scientist than the other. I had that question too. So you say that changed America, and I take it you mean that the best time of Roosevelt's conservation work came after this camping trip? How did they change America exactly in your mind?
I think, well, first of all, I originally had, because if you can't tell, I'm kind of prone to over-dramatization. I had the camping trip that saved America, right? And boy, that was an editorial meeting to end all editorial meetings and emails. Everyone was like, well, come on, we decided that changed was fair. Did the camping trip itself, was it only that camping trip that changed America? Probably not. But yes, I mean that that camping trip was kind of like the culmination of a long loop tour, everything that our other authors have talked about. Theodore Roosevelt was obviously had already saved some wilderness and was primed to save more with Pinchot, with many other people. So as a kind of a general thing, saved. And certainly to simplify, saved America. Changed America,
Sure,
not
yes,
saved America.
saved.
I'm still saying it
so,
in my head.
Last question, we have to go to lunch. What are you working on now?
Oh my goodness, the next book that comes out, I have 3 books coming out. One is with Mary Graham Prey, who did the Caldecott Honor book, The Noisy Paintbox, with me. We have a book called Vincent Can't Sleep, about Vincent van Gogh and the fact that he was an insomniac as a child. The next book after that is called Bluegrass Boy. If anyone's a bluegrass fan, it's a biography of Bill Monroe, the pioneer of bluegrass music. And the third one is called The Secret Kingdom, and it is a picture book about an artist in India named Nek Chand, who built an entire world, rebuilt his village after the partition of India and in art, and kept it secret for 20 years.
Barb Rosenstock, thank you. Sharon?